On the morning of September 20, 1942, at precisely 9:47 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders positioned himself in the pilot's seat of a Japanese fighter plane located at Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego, California. He was moments away from operating a warplane that had been responsible for killing a great number of American aviators. This specific aircraft was identified as a Mitsubishi A6M Model 2110 with the serial number 4593. It had previously been under the command of Flight Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga. Koga had died when his plane inverted and crashed into a marsh in the Aleutian Islands 2.5 months prior to this day. However, his fighter had been recovered largely intact. Now, Sanders was preparing to uncover critical information that would transform the combat strategies employed by American pilots across the Pacific theater. Sanders himself was a highly experienced naval aviator, having flown military aircraft for 9 years and accumulated a vast number of hours in flight testing, more than nearly any other pilot in the Navy. He possessed an intimate and thorough knowledge of aircraft, their behavior in flight, their response to controls, and the dangers they presented to a pilot who committed errors. The Zero facing him was now painted in the standard colors of the United States Navy, a blue-gray over light gull gray, with American national insignia prominently displayed on its wings and fuselage. Yet, despite its new paint, it remained fundamentally a Zero, the very same type of aircraft that had held dominance over the skies of the Pacific since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. It was still the fighter that American pilots feared more intensely than any other weapon deployed by the enemy. Sanders had dedicated significant time to reviewing all intelligence summaries that were available concerning the Zero. He had read through the personal narratives of pilots who had managed to survive engagements with it. He had also carefully studied aerial reconnaissance photographs. He was fully aware of the aircraft's fearsome statistical record. It had achieved a kill ratio of 12-1 in the air war over China. In a specific engagement on Easter Sunday, April 5, 1942, a force of 36 Zeros had encountered 60 British warplanes over Colombo. In that battle, the Japanese fighters succeeded in shooting down 27 of the British aircraft, which included 15 Hawker Hurricanes, 8 Fairey Swordfish, and 4 Fairey Fulmars, while losing only a single Zero of their own. American P-39 Airacobras were being destroyed when fighting at their operational altitude. F-2A Buffalo fighters were systematically massacred during the defense of the Philippines. The U.S. Navy's own F-4F Wildcats were finding it a tremendous challenge just to survive against an opponent that could execute tighter turns, achieve a faster rate of climb, and consistently outmaneuver any fighter the United States could send into the sky. The officially prescribed American tactic for confronting a Zero was straightforward in principle. Pilots were to avoid conventional, turning dogfights and instead rely on diving and zooming attacks. They were instructed not to engage the enemy in a turning battle and not to attempt to outmaneuver them, as such attempts would almost certainly end in defeat. However, the practical consequence of avoiding direct combat often meant that American fighters had to break away and abandon the bomber formations they were assigned to protect. It meant leaving a wingman to face the enemy alone and be shot down. It effectively meant surrendering air superiority to an adversary who would then use that advantage to attack and sink aircraft carriers, strafe and destroy airfields, and eliminate entire squadrons of aircraft while they were still on the ground. American pilots were dying in the air, and the primary reason was that no one had yet discovered a reliable method for defeating the Zero in combat. No one truly comprehended its specific weaknesses. No American had ever had the opportunity to fly one of these aircraft until this very moment. The particular Zero that Sanders was about to fly had been captured on Akutan Island in the Aleutian chain following the death of its pilot, Koga, on June 4, 1942. The effort to retrieve the aircraft from the marsh required 3 separate recovery missions, An initial team that arrived on July 11th inspected the crash site and recovered Koga's body. A second team, arriving on July 12th, failed in its attempt when their vessel lost both of its anchors. It was not until a third team, equipped with proper heavy machinery, arrived on July 15th that the aircraft was successfully extracted. The Zero was then transported by sea to Seattle aboard the USS St. Miguel, arriving on August 1st, before being moved by barge to its final destination in San Diego, where it arrived on August 12th. Navy maintenance crews and mechan. Ikes had subsequently spent many weeks repairing the various damages the aircraft had sustained. They worked on the bent vertical stabilizer, the damaged rudder, the crushed wingtips, the broken flaps, the shattered canopy, the compromised landing gear, and the broken propeller. They carefully straightened warped metal components, sourced or manufactured replacement parts for those that were broken, and fabricated from scratch any components that could not be located. The resulting aircraft was, as Sanders himself would later characterize it, 98% original Japanese manufacture and 2% American improvisation. Sanders initiated the engine start procedure. The 14-cylinder Nakajima Saki 12 radial engine came to life, producing a sound that was at once recognizable as a radial engine, yet also distinctly foreign in its pitch and rhythm. The propeller began to spin rapidly. Sanders methodically checked the array of cockpit instruments. The oil pressure indicator showed a normal reading, and the temperature gauge confirmed the engine was warming up steadily. All systems appeared to be functioning correctly. He then taxied the aircraft toward the assigned runway. The Zero felt unusually light while moving on the ground, and the controls were very responsive to his inputs. He had been briefed that the aircraft's maximum loaded weight was approximately 5,555 pounds, according to museum specification records. This made it 1,871 pounds lighter than an F4 Wildcat, which weighed 7,426 pounds. This substantial difference in weight was a critical factor in its performance. Sanders advanced the throttle to begin his takeoff roll. The Zero accelerated with impressive quickness. The tail wheel lifted from the runway surface, and the entire aircraft became airborne after a remarkably short takeoff run. Sanders retracted the landing gear and began a steady climb. The most immediate characteristic he noted was the exceptionally light feel of the flight controls. They were almost delicate in their response. The control stick moved with very little physical force required, and the airplane reacted instantly to every small input from the pilot. At lower airspeeds, the Zero handled superbly. It was stable in flight, its behavior was predictable, and it demonstrated incredible agility. Sanders executed a series of gentle turns, and the aircraft rolled into them smoothly. He then tried a steeper banking maneuver, and the Zero rotated around its axis with effortless ease. He instantly understood why the Japanese pilots who flew this aircraft held it in such high esteem. At slow speeds, no aircraft currently in the American inventory could hope to match its maneuverability. Sanders climbed the aircraft to an altitude of 5,000 feet and began a systematic exploration of its flight handling characteristics. He deliberately induced a stall. The Zero provided clear and ample warning signs before the wing finally lost lift, and then it recovered from the stall in a gentle and controlled manner. He then put the aircraft into a spin. It entered the spin cleanly and recovered from it promptly when he applied standard recovery controls. Every aspect of the Zero's low-speed flight behavior was forgiving, responsive, and beautifully harmonized. It was the kind of aircraft that could make an average pilot feel highly competent and a skilled pilot feel virtually invincible. Then, Sanders pushed the throttle forward to increase speed. At 190 knots, the Zero still felt responsive and the controls remained light. Sanders was almost starting to believe the near-mythical reports from pilots who claimed the Zero could perform any maneuver. But the moment he exceeded 200 knots of indicated airspeed, the situation changed dramatically. Sanders attempted to roll the aircraft to the right. The control stick moved in his hand, and the ailerons deflected in response, but the airplane's actual roll response was slow and noticeably sluggish. It felt as if the air itself had suddenly transformed into a substance as thick as molasses. Sanders found he had to use both hands on the control stick to force the aircraft into the roll. The Zero did eventually respond, but not with the quick, immediate reaction it had at lower speeds. There was a distinct and disconcerting lag between his control input and the aircraft's actual movement, a delay that had been entirely absent during low-speed flight. Sanders then attempted a roll to the left. The aircraft rolled more easily in this direction. It was still not as crisp as at low speed, but it was significantly better than the roll to the right. There was a clear and pronounced asymmetry in the lateral controls. The Zero exhibited a definite preference for rolling to the left. Executing a roll to the right demanded significantly more physical force from the pilot and yielded a markedly slower and less responsive roll rate. Sanders increased the speed further to 220 knots, then to 240 knots. The co-entrail problem intensified. By the time he reached 250 knots, performing a roll to the right had become a physical impossibility for the pilot. Based on his subsequent official reports, the ailerons effectively became frozen in place. The control stick required an enormous amount of force to budge, and the aircraft's response was minimal. Sanders later described the sensation as similar to trying to roll a heavy truck, not a nimble fighter plane. This was the critical weakness he had been seeking. This was the intelligence that American pilots desperately needed. The Zero could not execute rapid rolling maneuvers at high speeds, a limitation that was particularly severe for rolls to the right. It was incapable of performing swift, high-speed directional reversals above 200 knots. Any American pilot who was aware of this limitation could exploit it tactically. The procedure was to draw the Zero into a high-speed engagement, force its airspeed above 200 knots, and then execute a hard roll to the right before the Japanese pilot could align his sights. The Zero would be unable to match this maneuver. Its flight controls would lock up, allowing the American pilot to escape the attack or quickly reverse his own flight path to gain a firing position, while the Zero pilot struggled to make his aircraft respond. Sanders continued his test flight, exploring other flight regimes. He pushed the Zero into a steep, nose-down dive to test its behavior under negative acceleration. The aircraft's engine promptly coughed and then died completely. This was due to the design of its carburetor, which was a float-type system incapable of maintaining fuel flow under negative G-force conditions. The fuel supply was interrupted, causing the engine to starve and shut down until Sanders leveled the aircraft and restored positive G-forces. This was the second major weakness he identified. The Zero could not follow an American aircraft through a pushover dive, a common evasive tactic. Its engine would inevitably cut out. Therefore, any American pilot being chased by a Zero could simply push his aircraft's nose down sharply, subjecting the pursuing Zero to negative GS, and watch as the enemy's engine quit, while the American's own engine, typically equipped with a pressure-fed carburetor, would continue to run normally. Sanders also took note of the Zero's complete lack of protective armor for the pilot. There was no steel plate behind the cockpit seat and no bulletproof glass in the canopy. Furthermore, the aircraft's fuel tanks lacked any form of self-sealing lining. This meant that just a few hits from the powerful .50 caliber machine guns carried by American fighters would likely cause the Zero to catch fire and be destroyed. The Japanese designers had clearly sacrificed crew protection and aircraft survivability in order to achieve maximum performance and light weight. The aircraft was fast and agile precisely because it was lightweight and unarmored. However, this design philosophy also meant that Zero pilots were highly vulnerable and could be killed easily if their aircraft was hit by enemy fire. Sanders landed the Zero after a flight lasting 25 minutes. He climbed out of the cockpit and immediately began writing his preliminary test report. His hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline and intensity of the experience. He had just personally flown the most feared and dangerous enemy aircraft in the entire Pacific theater, and he had successfully identified its fundamental design flaws. His official report stated in clear and unambiguous terms that the Zero's ailerons became effectively frozen at speeds exceeding 200 knots, making rolling maneuvers at such speeds extremely slow and requiring immense physical force on the control stick. He further noted that the aircraft rolled to the left with much greater ease than to the right. Additionally, he reported that its engine cut out under conditions of negative acceleration due to the inherent limitation of its float-type carburetor. In his report, Sanders provided the essential tactical solution for American pilots who found themselves being outmaneuvered and unable to escape from a pursuing Zero. He advised them to enter a vertical power dive, using negative acceleration if possible to increase the separation distance, while the Zero's engine was stopped by the negative G-forces. Then, at an airspeed of approximately 200 knots, they were to execute a hard roll to the right before the Zero's pilot could achieve a proper firing solution. These few sentences of tactical advice, based on direct flight testing, would subsequently save the lives of hundreds of American airmen. Sanders conducted a total of 23 additional test flights over the next 25 days, from September 20th to October 15th, 1942. Each successive flight served to confirm and reinforce the discoveries he had made on that first, historic sortie. The Zero was, without question, an exceptional and deadly aircraft in a low-speed dogfight, but it possessed serious and exploitable limitations when flown at high speeds. American combat tactics needed to be revised accordingly. The new doctrine was clear: stop trying to turn with the Zero. Instead, American pilots were to use their aircraft's speed advantage, employ high-speed maneuvering tactics, utilize hard right rolls at speeds above 200 knots, and use negative G pushovers to induce a flameout in the Zero's engine. These critical tactical recommendations were immediately transmitted via radio to all units of the U.S. Pacific Fleet shortly after Sanders' first flight in late September 1942. Pilots stationed in active combat zones received these new briefing materials within a matter of days. Some pilots were initially skeptical. The Zero had dominated aerial combat for so long that many found it difficult to believe it had any significant weaknesses that could be exploited. Other pilots, however, were desperate for any kind of advantage that would increase their chances of survival, and they began to implement the new tactics immediately. Marine First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh was among the very first combat pilots to successfully apply Sanders' discoveries in actual air-to-air combat. Walsh was piloting an F-4U Corsair on August 15, 1943, during the intense fighting of the Solomon Islands campaign, when he engaged a formation of enemy aircraft over Vella Le Vella. During that engagement, he successfully shot down 2 Japanese dive bombers and 1 fighter. Then, on August 30th, over the area of Kahili, he encountered a large formation of approximately 50 Zeros. Walsh had previously attended a tactical briefing that detailed the findings from the captured Zero. He knew exactly what he had to do. When a Zero maneuvered into a position directly behind his aircraft, Walsh immediately put his Corsair into a split-S maneuver, a half-roll followed by a steep, descending dive. His Corsair accelerated rapidly as it dove. He knew he needed to reach at least 240 knots, and preferably 260 knots. Then, exactly as prescribed by Sanders' report, Walsh executed a hard roll to the right. As he rolled and continued his high-speed dive, he could see the tracer rounds from the Zero's guns zipping past the underside of his aircraft. The Japanese pilot was firing, but his aim was off because his aircraft could not roll to the right fast enough to maintain an accurate tracking solution on Walsh's maneuvering Corsair. Walsh later stated that he knew from the intelligence derived from the captured Zero that it rolled much more slowly to the right than to the left. He also noted that if he had not possessed this specific knowledge, he would likely have instinctively rolled to the left. Had he done so, the Zero would have been able to turn with him, maintain its firing position, and almost certainly have shot him down. In that single engagement, Walsh shot down 4 Zeros before his own aircraft was so badly damaged that he was forced to ditch in the ocean. For his extraordinary heroism and success in this and other actions, he was later awarded the Medal of Honor. He credited the life-saving information that came from the flight testing of the captured Zero with preserving his life on multiple occasions. Walsh ultimately survived the war, achieving a total of 21 confirmed aerial victories and becoming the fourth highest scoring ace in the United States Marine Corps.